Hello everyone and welcome to today's sew along. As you can see, we're going to be doing this one a little bit differently to what we've done previously. We're going to be doing it made up of images. So let's see how it goes, and I look forward to hearing from you to tell me what you think of doing this form of sew along, and if you find it better, worse, more helpful. And I'm always interested in your feedback, so please feel free to send it to me. So yes, today's sew along is the ladies' short sleeve shirt dress. Wow, it's quite a mouthful, short sleeve shirt dress. Okay, so for this sewing pattern, the suggested type of fabric would be a sort of cotton or a poly cotton shirting, or a very sort of soft woven fabric. It is really not suited for any stretch fabrics. So yeah, definitely go for a nice soft woven fabric, and you'll need about 22 to 25 or so buttons of about 12 millimeters or half an inch in diameter. Then you're going to require some iron-on interfacing. You're looking at about a 50 centimeter or a 20-inch length. Then your fabric itself, you're looking at about 2.5 meters or 2.8 yards, and that's the safest amount if you're looking at 115 centimeter or 45-inch width. It's not too difficult a pattern at all. It does, however, require a lot of preparation, a lot more so than any of the patterns. There's a lot of pressing that needs to happen before you even really get into your sewing. So first you're going to start out by printing out your pattern and cutting it out to the size that you want. There is that video that we posted that shows you how to assemble your pattern, and there are instructions in the instructions that's supplied with this pattern. But if you're not too sure, just watch that video and you'll find it will explain everything quite nicely for you. Okay, so once you've cut out your pattern, the first you're going to cut out your interfacing sections before you even cut out your fabric. Now I like to do this first. As you see, there's two sections on this pattern. It's the collar and the collar stand. Both the collar and the collar stand require that you cut two sections of the fabric on the fold. So it works out a bit easier if you cut out the interfacing first and then use that as a second pattern piece to cut out your fabric all at one time. And then when you transfer the markings for the collar and the collar stand, transfer it only onto the right side or the non-glue side of your interfacing. And then you don't actually have to transfer those markings onto your collar and collar stand pieces themselves. So yes, use those to cut out the fabric and attach the collar and collar stand pieces to the two sections of fabric you've cut out. So it'll be the glue side, if you're using a glue interfacing, on the wrong side of the fabric, and then you're either going to iron it or baste it on. I like to do both because I always find that the glue doesn't always work as well as it should. So I iron on the interfacing, and then I still do a loose base stitch around the edge just to make sure that the interfacing isn't going to move anywhere. And then I use the cut out pattern pieces to cut out the rest of the fabric and transfer all of the markings, and those markings are transferred onto the wrong side of the fabric. You're going to start first with the center front seam of the front section. You're going to fold along the first fold line. You're going to fold the fabric inwards towards the wrong side, and you're going to press that flat. I do say in instructions that you should baste it, but that's just to make sure it doesn't move. But if you're like me, put a bit of starch in the water that you use to spray the fabric when you're pressing, and that'll actually be strong enough to hold it in place, because straight after you fold over and pressed that along that first fold line, you're going to go back and fold over on the second fold line, and you'll be pressing that flat. And once that is pressed flat, just along the edge of the actual fold. So if you're looking at the wrong side of your fabric, along the first fold edge, as close to the edge as possible. Just stitch it flat from top to bottom, and then that will hold your center front facing on both the front sections in place. Taking this time to press those facings properly is really worth it. You don't want to sort of wing it, otherwise your fabric can very easily pull out of shape and bubble, or just look very untidy. So make sure you take the time to press it properly. Then using a bit of starch in your spray water really does go a long way to having a professional neat finish. Now when you are stitching, I'm going to mention this a lot during all the sew-alongs, but when you are stitching, always stitch in the same direction. And by this what I mean is you now have two front sections of your dress, the left side and the right side. When you are stitching that front interfacing, it is best to stitch them both in the same direction. So you'll be stitching ideally from top to bottom. You can sew one side from top to bottom and then the other from bottom to top if that's easier for you, but fabric loves to pull slightly out of shape. So what you'll find is if you sew them in different directions, they may not line up at the end of the day. So just to make sure your fabric lines up and looks even, always stitch in the same direction. So on the left side for the front facing, sew from top to bottom, and on the right side do the same, sew from top to bottom, just to prevent your fabric from becoming unaligned. And the same, the other, all your other seams, side seams, shoulder seams, whichever seams you're looking at, sew in the same direction. Shoulder seams, always sew from shoulder to neckline if possible. Don't sew one side from shoulder to neckline and the other side from neckline to shoulder, because it can adjust the sit of your fabric just by pulling it out slightly. So just to keep that professional look, sew in the same direction from top to bottom, and then the shoulders from shoulder to neck, or from sleeve to neck. Okay, so now you've sewn the facing flat on your two front sections. On the left side, you're going to create the buttonholes along your folded facing area. So from the top of the center front, measure 5 centimeters or 2 inches down to mark for your first buttonhole. Then measure the rest of the buttonholes down the length of the facing and space them out 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches apart. And so you have got a total of about 14 to 15 buttonholes down the full length front. So take the time, measure it out correctly, and mark it correctly before you actually start sewing those buttonholes. And just taking a little bit of extra time with these sort of things does make a difference. Yes, it'll take you a bit longer to make your garment, but just winging it and taking the time will give you a huge difference in quality. Okay, great. Now that we've done the center front, we are now going to be doing the pockets. So to start, all your pocket sections, so you'll have 4 for each side, 8 pocket sections in total, 4 top sections and 4 bottom pocket sections. Go to overlock or serge along the edges of all the pocket sections. This is just to make them look neater. It's not essential, but it's really just a case of making your shirt look neater. If you don't have an overlock or a serger, then all you do is just fold over the edge of the pockets by like 2 millimeters. It's about like a 1/16 of an inch, I think. So just fold over the edges by that and just baste them flat, and then press them when you're done to make sure that they stay in shape. Okay, so once you have neatened off all the edges, the first step you're going to do is along the opening sections of all the pockets. So on the pocket flaps, it'll be along the diagonal bottom length, and on the actual pockets themselves, it'll be along the top opening sections. You're going to fold those edges over by about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. And you're going to press it flat, and then you're going to stitch it the standard stitch size. You're going to stitch that into place. Remember, something like this, pressing first, once again affects the quality of the garment. So if you can fold and press first, you'll have a much neater look at the end of the day than if you just fold and stitch it. Even if you press after you stitch it, it never quite looks the same. So fold, press, then stitch. Okay, so once you've folded over and stitched the opening sections, you go to place the overlap sections along the placement lines on the pocket sections. So you're going to be taking so that the wrong side of the pocket flap is against the right side of the fabric. So it's literally sitting on top of the fabric for the pockets. And then you're going to base down the sides, and only the sides, just to keep those pockets secure and in place. The flaps on top of the pockets. You can machine base, just to use a very loose or large stitch size. Okay, so once you have done that, now comes the chore of doing a lot of pressing. And so if you love to use your iron, you're going to love this. If not, I honestly suggest you just grit and bear it. But I don't mind so much, so I could spend a day pressing things and then I still feel like I've accomplished something. Okay, so starting at the bottom is usually the easiest, and then moving my way up to the top. So what I'll do is I'll fold the edges of the pocket sections inwards along the given fold line. So you're folding it inwards towards the wrong side. Pin it into place. So start at the bottom, fold the bottom, press it, and then you can pin it into place or baste it into place. Yeah, I would suggest is using a pin to hold your pressed fabric into place. Do that. Once you've done the two bottom sections, then move on to the sides. Fold the sides inwards, press. Yeah, especially because you have a seam that's going to be part of the pressing. Use a bit of starch in your water just to make sure your fabric is going to behave, so to speak. So press flat, pin into position, and then lastly along the top of the pocket flap, press that fabric inwards along the fold line and press flat and pin it into place. So once you've done the 4 pocket sections, you're then going to place them at the markings on the front sections of your shirt dress. So you'll see the small pockets go along the top placement lines and the bottom pockets go along the bottom placement lines. So what I would suggest here is you find a place big enough to lay out both your front sections together side by side. Once you've done that, put your pockets over the placement lines and just double check that they are lined up on both sides and that they are sitting straight and that they look the same. I know that sometimes transferring the markings, you might go down a millimeter or up a millimeter, things like that. So just use your eye, and before you pin and stitch those pockets into place, make sure those pockets are evenly lined up. Just to, once you've done the stitching, that you don't want to have to now undo everything because you've discovered you've sewn one pocket, the pocket on the left side is lower than the pocket on the right side. So just double check before you stitch. If you're happy with the way that the pockets have lined up, pin them securely and then do a stitch around to make sure they're not going anywhere. Okay, once you have stitched those on, just give it a good press just to neaten up the look. Okay, so your front pieces are now completely finished. We're going to start working on the back section. We're going to start by doing the yoke. The yoke or the dress is designed in this way because that section of your back is the section of your dress that will get the most tension and the most wear and tear. So that's why we have a yoke there and we double up on the fabric just to give your dress a bit of extra strength. So yes, you have two yoke sections and one center back piece. You're going to start by attaching one of the yoke pieces to the back. So right sides of fabric facing, line them up, stitch them together using a standard 1.5 centimeters to 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once you've done that, then on the other side of the shirt, so on the wrong side of the shirt fabric, you're going to attach the second yoke piece. So it'll be the right side of the fabric of the yoke against the wrong side of the shirt fabric. You're going to line that up and stitch that into place. Once you have sandwiched the shirt like that in between the two yoke sections, you're going to press that seam nice and flat. And quite often with shirting and polycotton, you can still see the seam slightly through the fabric. So just to make it look neat, serge or overlock it. It's not necessary because the seam is sort of encapsulated in the fabric, but just to give it a little serge or overlock just to give it a little bit of a neat edge. Make sure it's pressed as neat as possible. So what you do is you're going to fold the yokes upwards so the two yoke sections are facing, and you're going to press them flat like that. And then along that seam edge, so as close to that seam edge as possible, you're going to do a top stitch along that edge. Just stitch along that seam as close to the seam as possible, or say about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the seam. Stitch it flat so you're going to be stitching that seam neatly and just sandwiching everything together, a nice finish. Then on the yoke on the inside, so the yoke that you stitched facing the wrong side of the fabric, along the edges of those shoulders of that yoke section, fold over the seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. So fold over that seam allowance and press it flat. Because you're not going to be working it straight away, I would recommend that you baste it to make sure that that stays flat and doesn't sort of unfold and lose its shape. So fold it over, press it and baste it, and again baste it in the same direction on both sides. So you're going to be either basting from the arms to the neck or from the neck to the arms, but either way make sure you're stitching in the same direction. Take your back section and your front section, the right sides of the fabric facing, stitch the back and front sections together at the shoulder lines of the outer yoke, so not the yoke that you press, the other yoke section. So you're going to be stitching it together along the shoulder lines and make sure that you stitch in the same direction. Press that seam towards the back section and you can overlock that or serge that. Once you have pressed that seam flat, you're then going to take the other yoke section and fold it on top. So that felt seam that you pressed a little bit earlier, you're now going to place over the seam you just completed. So you're going to hide that seam. And once you've done that, pin into place and then stitch it flat. Stitch the yoke flat about 2 millimeters or 1/60 of an inch near the edge. So as close to the edge as possible, lining up the fold line to the stitch seam. So close to the edge as possible, stitch it flat. So now you're going to be closing that yoke section completely and you're not going to be seeing those seams. Then just to make sure your fabric doesn't move, along the necklines and the arm lines where the raw And when I say raw edges, I'm talking about unfinished seams and seams that aren't overlocked. So where the raw edges of the fabric of the neckline and the sleeves, the armholes, line those up and then just baste them into place so that the two yoke fabrics don't move independently from one another. Right, so next we're moving on to the collar section. I know for a lot of people this is quite scary, but I promise you the collar is actually a lot easier than it looks. So lay your two collar pieces together, that's the top collar pieces, together right sides facing, and sew along the sides and the top edge. So that seam, so you sew up the sides, then you go to lift your needle on your sewing machine, pivot the fabric on the pivot point. So the pivot point is the corner where the two seam allowances meet for the top and the sides. You would have transferred that marking when you transferred it onto the interfacing. So at the pivot point, lift your foot on your sewing machine, pivot your fabric on the sewing needle, put the foot down and then stitch along the top. And when you get to the other side's pivot point, do the same. Stitch down the side, and then what you will do once you've done that is you're going to clip away this corners. Clip away as much fabric as possible. You want to do this because you don't want bulk in the corner of your collar. You want to try to get rid of all that bulk fabric, so you want to clip away as much fabric as you possibly can. And then you'll turn your collar right side out, push out the corners and press everything flat. So before you even stitch along the edge, press your collar flat, make sure it looks as neat as possible, and then stitch along the edge. So you're going to top stitch along that seam you just created about 5 millimeters or an eighth near the edge. Just top stitch along just to neaten it off. Then you're going to take one of your collar stand sections. You take the piece without the interfacing along the bottom of that section without the interfacing. You're going to fold that bottom seam over by 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. Press it into place. You may find that you need to just take a pair of embroidery scissors and clip along the seam to make sure it lies as flat and neat as possible. So clip along that seam, press it neatly into place, and then just do a loose base stitch to make sure it stays in position. When attaching the collar and the collar stand pieces together, it is always good to keep in mind that the collar stand without the interfacing is going to go against the section of the collar with the interfacing, and a collar stand with interfacing will go against the section of the collar without interfacing. So basically what that means is now you got to take that section of the collar stand that you just finished pressing, and right sides facing, you're going to line it up with the raw edge of your finished collar section, but you're going to line it up against the right side of the fabric of the part of the collar that has interfacing on. Then you're going to take your second collar stand, and right sides facing against the collar, you're going to attach it onto the other side. So you are now sandwiching your collar between the two collar stand sections. So line up the markings in the patterns, and you'll see that you will need to clip along the collar and the collar stand in order to assist them in sitting neatly together. Remember, you're taking flat pieces of fabric and turning them into a 3D garment, so you need to do things like clipping in the seams in order to mold that fabric into your 3D item. So pin everything together and clip along that seam no more than by about a centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, just to get those 3 pad pieces now to sit nice and neatly together. Once you are happy with how they are sitting, you can then stitch down the side along the length of the seam and down the other side. Then clip away the corners of the collar stand to take away that excess fabric. So once you turn it right side out, there's no bulk of the fabric sitting in the corners. So clip away those corners, turn your collar stands right side out, push out the corners and press everything flat to make sure that it sits neatly and smoothly. Once everything is pressed flat and you're happy with the way everything is sitting, just do a quick double check to make sure there's an even space on either side of the collar from where the collar joins to the collar stand to the end seam. Just make sure there's even spacing and double check your work. And if you're happy with the way everything is sitting, then just do a stitch along the top of that seam you just did, not the side seam, just the top seam where you sandwiched in the collar into the collar stand. So you'll be stitching about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch near the edge. Just give it a standard stitch flat. Right, and then as you can see, your collar is pretty much complete already. The next thing is to attach it to your main bodice sections. Stitch the interface collar stand edge to the neckline of the dress. But you have to clip the dress neckline where necessary to fit it to the collar stand. Press your seam upwards when you're done for neatness. Now you're going to baste your previously pressed collar stand seam, the side without the interfacing, to the seam at the neckline. So just line everything up and baste it flat into position. And then once everything's pressed and basted into place and you know it's not going to move and you're happy with how it's sitting, then stitch along the seams, closing in the shirt. So you're now going to be stitching it and making sure that the shirt neckline is completely enclosed in the collar stand. And you're going to stitch about 5 millimeters or 1/8 from the edge of that seam, making sure everything is neatly enclosed in. And as simply as that, your collar is now attached to your dress. How easy was that? So then on the left side of the collar stand, now that everything is finished being sewn, on the left side of the collar stand, sew a buttonhole for your top button. Okay, so it's going to be on the same side as all your other buttons. Sew that buttonhole for the top button. Alright, next step, attaching of the sleeve. Pin each sleeve to the armhole edge of the dress, with right sides of your fabric facing, matching all of the markings. So the markings at the cap of the sleeve, that's the curved edge, should match the marking on the yoke for the shoulder line. Clip your armholes where necessary to fit the sleeve cap. So first pin your shirt and sleeve together, and if you're happy with how everything is sitting, then stitch with the standard stitch allowance and press and overlock that seam for neatness. Then with right sides facing, fold your sleeves so that the seams meet and the front and back seams of the dress meet. So you're now going to be closing your side seam and your sleeve seam. So pin together and stitch from the bottom of the dress hemline up to the armhole. You may need to lift the foot on your sewing machine and pivot your fabric on the needle, and then lower your foot again in order to sew down the length of the sleeve. Right, once you've done that, press and overlock that seam. Now you're going to be hemming the sleeve of your dress. So you got to hem the sleeve by folding the fabric inwards to the wrong side by 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch, and you're going to press that flat, and then you're going to stitch it into place. Once you've done that, you're going to fold it over again a second time, again by 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch, and you're going to stitch and press it flat again. And that is your sleeve complete and attached to your dress. Very easy, right? Now you're going to hem the bottom of your dress in a similar manner. First, you're going to fold the hem inwards by 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. You're going to press it flat. Now, especially with a section of the pattern that is very curved, like the bottom of the dress, it is very important that you press first. Make sure everything is sitting flat and neat, and then stitch. And don't be afraid to use a little bit of starch during the pressing process, just to make sure that the dress sits nice and neat and you have a beautiful looking hem. So press it, stitch it, fold it over again a second time, again by 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. You can, for the hem of the dress, for the second fold, you can go up by as much as 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. You can fold it by that much as well. Okay, press your hem flat again and then stitch it back into place. And that is your dress hem. So all you need to do now is attach your buttons. So line up your front facing together, see where your buttonholes are, then using chalk or a marking pen, make marks on the opposite facing where you're going to be sewing on your buttons. Make sure everything is lined up perfectly. If you're happy with all the markings, then you can attach your buttons. And yeah, quite easily, just like that, your dress is finished. So like I said, it's quite an easy dress. This is all the preparation and a whole lot of pressing that takes most of your time. And feel free to share your creations with us on Instagram at @BoulaHeart, and enjoy and happy sewing.